Well, good afternoon. Hello, I'm Susan Shirk. I'm the chair of the 21st Century China Center here at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. And I'm very pleased that we could host Craig Allen, the president of the US-China Business Council today. I'm also really pleased that we could host this important webinar together with our colleague Renee Bowen, who is the chair of the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy at our school. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions or make comments after Ambassador Allen gives his talk. And let me just introduce Ambassador Allen. He is the president of the US-China Business Council. The US-China Business Council is a private, nonpartisan organization representing a large number of American companies doing business with China. And before he became president of this important organization in 2018, he had a long and distinguished career as a public servant in the Commerce Department, as a commercial counselor serving in China, Taiwan, Japan, and as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Asia in the Commerce Department, as a senior Foreign Service officer, diplomat, and finally as ambassador to Brunei before he retired. And so he's been doing a wonderful job leading the US-China Business Council. He's very thoughtful about trade policy and relations with China more broadly, and especially about the implications for America's interests and values. So what I asked him to do in this talk was to think really hard about what kind of American policy toward China, trade policy, could really be of value for working Americans. Because there's some impression that some of us have that although Americans by and large are pro-trade, they don't necessarily see any real value in the US relationship with China. And so the question confronting the new administration is what kind of trade policy will really be good for working Americans. So without further ado, I'm going to ask him to speak. He has some PowerPoint slides. He'll speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll start with a few questions and open it up to the floor. So thanks very much for being with us today.
Well, Susan, what a great pleasure. And let me thank you and Sam and Lei and the 21st Century China Center and the UCSD Global Policy and Strategy College. Let me also thank Renee for joining us, and to everyone on the call. Thank you for spending some time to think about trade policy with regard to China. Frankly, I wish I could be in San Diego. You have such a beautiful campus. Much rather do this personally, but virtually. Let me share some observations about US-China relations and the impact of the bilateral tension on employment in the United States. And so just to scene set, the US-China relations at the dawn of the Biden administration present us with a really difficult, or the policymakers with a really difficult conundrum. So in his speech at the State Department on February 4, the president said that, quote, every action we take in our conduct abroad, we must take with American working families in mind. And the administration has said many, many times that full employment is probably the most important domestic policy goal that we have, or certainly one of the most important. In the same speech, the president said, we will, quote, we will confront China's economic abuses, counter its aggressive and coercive actions, to push back on China's attack on human rights, intellectual property, and global governance. And I would argue that there's an inbuilt tension between these two sets of foreign policy objectives. How is it that we confront China where we must, but still work to maximize the economic employment for Americans? Certainly, that's going to take some deft diplomacy and statecraft to accomplish both goals, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. And I have some 10 specific policy suggestions I'd like to make on maximizing employment in the US by leveraging China's growth without compromising any of our geopolitical or diplomatic objectives. But before talking about that, I have a few very large caveats. The first caveat is that the correlation of trade policies to specific outcomes in the labor market is in fact very weak. President Trump, for example, pursued a protectionist policy, trade policy, yet employment before COVID was very strong. President Trump was on track to add 9 million new jobs during his first administration. But that is almost entirely due to loose fiscal and monetary policy. The point is that trade policy does have an impact on employment, which we will discuss today, but it's relatively small, the tail being wagged by the dog, if you will. My second caveat is that future technological change will obviously impact the US labor market in ways that are impossible to predict. The future of autonomous driving, for example, will have a far larger impact on employment in the US than trade policy. But technological competition is also a key element of US-China relations. And I'll say more about China's policies of self-reliance and self-strengthening in a bit. But we need to note that technological change is driving this very rapidly in ways that we cannot predict. The third caveat about US trade policy and China relations is that we can't really make firm conclusions without taking into account distortions in China's domestic macroeconomy. Wen Jiabao in 2007 famously said that China's economic growth was, quote, unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable, end quote. Premier Wen's observation is probably as true now as it was when he said this. And there are, of course, profound implications for policymakers around the world. So let me try and summarize this just real quick. Household consumption in China today is less than 40% of total GDP. This is in contrast to about 60 to 70% average in OECD countries. So from a comparative perspective, China hugely oversaves and overinvests in often uneconomic infrastructure at the expense of family consumption. This drives overcapacity, overinvestment, and implicitly subsidizes exports at the expense of Chinese workers, consumers, and China's foreign trade partners. The good news is that the Chinese government recognizes the imbalances, and they've articulated an intention to address the underlying issues by expanding consumption and expanding the middle class. So we should all watch the National People's Congress in March, when I expect we'll learn more about, quote, dual circulation, unquote, and the state's plan to expand consumption as a percentage of GDP. Will these policies be effective in growing the middle class and raising consumption? Will they be WTO compatible? What will be the impact of dual circulation on China's trading partners? The transition from an economy based on capital investment and net exports to one based on domestic consumption is a really difficult process that is going to require moving as much as 2 or 3 percentage points of GDP from overinvestment to consumption for perhaps the next 10 years if China is to escape Wen Jiabao's unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable paradigm. So having recognized the primacy of macroeconomic adjustments in China and also in the United States, where we have our own adjustments to do, let me move on to trade policy. Notwithstanding the importance of the macroeconomic adjustment and changing technology, trade policy will have a very large impact on employment. Future economic historians are going to look back at the Trump era with tremendous interest for its many innovations in trade policy. The last 4 years will provide a cornucopia of evidence on the costs and the benefits of tariffs and other trade policies. And while we really don't have the benefit of a historian's hindsight, I think that the evidence very strongly suggests that despite what might have been the best intentions, the tariffs and the other trade wars of the Trump era had a very negative net impact on American employment. Yes, it's true that many jobs have been created, but we can be certain that many more jobs have been lost. Now, if Ambassador Lighthizer or Professor Navarro were in this virtual room, they would no doubt raise the jobs in aluminum smelters and steel mills that were saved. But what they probably wouldn't say is that each of those jobs came at the cost of 900,000 US dollars, according to Chad Bown of the Peterson Institute. And in manufacturing, the hit to US employment has been very direct through decreased exports to China, but indirect through declines in total factor productivity and competitiveness. So let me give you one very specific example to illustrate this point. A tool maker, American branded tool maker, imported parts from China for many, many years and assembled them in the US and then sold their branded tools around the world. When the tariffs went up, many of their components were hit by a 25% tariff. And it took them all years to find alternative suppliers at a good price, and that process is still going on. Because they were manufacturing in the US with Chinese components, they had to raise prices and subsequently lost market share here in the US as well as abroad to competitors. Everyone in the US is worse off. And I'm afraid this story can be retold 10,000 times over across much of the manufacturing sector. So USCBC recently commissioned a study on this subject from Oxford Economics. And the bottom line that we came up with was that at its peak, approximately 245,000 American jobs were lost as a part of the trade war. So let me go through a couple of charts here. I'm going to be bold and try and share my screen here. Let's see if I'm able to do this. Oh, okay, so far so good. All right, here we go. So let me go through a few charts here to try and describe the industries and geographies where jobs have been lost. The first chart is just a level set. It shows total US exports by category to China. And you'll notice that services are a very important part of the export mix to China, making up as much as 40% of our total exports. And certainly this is the part of our exports that are growing most rapidly. I hope that you could see this. My second chart focuses on the manufacturing in both China and the United States, and it shows the impact of the trade war on those various sectors in terms of gross value add. I think that this chart demonstrates very well that Mr. Trump's tariffs had their intended effect in China. China GVA in all of these industries declined, But in all cases, US GVA in the same industries also declined, sometimes more and sometimes less. But it's fair to say that both sides lost. Kind of like two guys that get into a fight and one guy breaks the other guy's nose and the other guy breaks off a couple of teeth. Who won? My third chart um, shows the impact of the trade war on employment from a regional perspective. It is not equal. The underlying data is job gains or losses from US exports to China, and so this does not include total factor productivity. Nonetheless, it is instructive that those states that mostly rely on commodity production and manufacturing have been most badly hurt by trade. It is important to note the excessive reliance on bilateral tariffs on our trading partners will almost always rebound on American farmers in grain growing areas in the Midwest. When other countries retaliate against WTO illegal use of tariffs in the United States, they inevitably choose to hit back at American farmers where they'll get the biggest bang for their buck. And you see that very clearly in these charts here. So while President Trump spent $28 billion to compensate American grain farmers for their losses, the compensation has been very unevenly distributed and couldn't nearly make up for the loss of the hard-earned market share and long-term prospects in China and elsewhere. The Chinese are developing alternative sources of supply for grain and soybean, just like the Soviets did after the grain embargo. And this will rebound. We'll feel the effects of this for decades to come. But because of the subsidies, the unemployment effects on American farmers is really hard to calculate. So I heard of a small American dairy farm in Wisconsin in 2018 that had to sell his 80 cows to a neighbor who had 800 cows due to low prices of milk, in part due to the retaliatory tariffs put on US dairy by China. The farmer then took a job as a long distance trucker. So while he wasn't technically unemployed, the composition of the labor market changed. And this just demonstrates how hard it is to directly correlate trade policy to specific employment. And then to introduce the next part of my talk, I'd like to share data from Oxford Economics on the economic and employment impact of the trade war if we were to reduce the tariffs from the current 20% to just 12%, to drop the tariffs by about half. This would lead to slow but steady creation of new jobs, as many as 150,000 over 5 years. If we change our assumptions, however, and totally remove the tariffs, the job gains in the United States would be much higher, but again, difficult to estimate exactly. So with this as background, let me move on to my policy prescriptions. And I have some 10 of them. First, I think that the US and China really need to reinstitute a forum to discuss the really critical macroeconomic issues that impact the well-being of the other. There's an urgent need to dialogue and to understand and perhaps shape the macroeconomic decisions that will be made by China that will impact employment in the United States. Something like the SNED should be reestablished to provide technical support to assist China to adjust its economic model towards greater consumption as a percentage of GDP. That should be the very clear goal, as articulated by the Chinese government. Alternatively, we could consider more narrow technical dialogues revolving around specific problems. And there are many here that are associated with that escaping the middle income trap or increasing consumption. how to address and wind down overcapacity in industries in China, how to improve the China social safety net so Chinese citizens don't feel that they need to save 60% of their income. How does China prepare for an aging society? How does China correct the misallocation of capital to SOEs? How does China correct the corporate governance of them to ensure that they pay their fair share of their profits to the treasury? How do you get greater transparency for government subsidies to ensure WTO compatibility? And while it's not really, it's a Chinese domestic subject, but it impacts savings and therefore trade greatly. How do you abolish the hukou system? It needs to be addressed. It's not a trade issue, but you can't solve the trade issues without addressing these problems. Another reason why we need this macro discussion with China is that, in my view, we need to change the bilateral conversation from protectionism and containment of the Trump administration. And we need to move on to have a more realistic and pragmatic conversation about ensuring that China's rise is peaceful and not deleterious to its neighbors and trading partners. How do we square a state and a party-run economic system within a global system as envisioned by the WTO? These are big questions and not easy to and there are no easy answers. But talking is better than not talking. My second suggestion is that we really need to fully implement the phase one deal. Phase one has many critics, and they note that China has met only approximately 60% of their purchase obligations in their first year. But I'll note, as this graph shows, the exports in 2020 from January to December, that our exports have done very well, and they're on a good trend. And this is directly as a result of phase one. Let me go on. Now, phase one has had varying results. On the agriculture side, they've done pretty well. Manufacturing less well, and in energy not as well, mostly due to energy prices rather than the numbers of molecules that have been exported. And let me just go one more. This is the percentage of the purchases that the Chinese committed to make at 100%, that is, compared to what they actually did make. In agriculture, they made 81% of their purchases, in manufacturing 56, and in energy 37. There's a fourth category, services, that are not on here, and undoubtedly that was a disaster as a result of COVID. And I want to thank the Peterson Institute for these numbers. And indeed, let me just do a sidebar here. If you look at the Peterson Institute website today, they came out with beautiful graphics, very sophisticated, exactly on this subject. So I commend that to you. But let me go on and say that the Chinese government has said until now that they fully intend to meet their commitments under the deal. And I think that we really have to insist that they do so. USTR, DOC, DOE, and DOA should initiate negotiations to understand how the Chinese will do that, and make that a predicate for our for smooth sailing later. We have to implement our commitments, and this deal runs another year, and so that rapidly upward sloping graph, I think if we if we continue the deal, we could expect that graph to continue going up, which will bring much needed jobs to the United States in 2021 and throughout the rest of the year. So let me go on. Third, we need to begin negotiations on a phase two agreement to be completed prior to the expiration of phase one. A target date set for completion could be when President Biden and President Xi meet on the virtual margins of the APEC meeting in New Zealand, which will be held November 10 through 13. That's about the right amount of time. The issues that were not resolved in 2019 for the Phase 1 agreement are state-owned enterprises, subsidies, industrial technology policy, and cyber. And while all of these are difficult issues, the Chinese side has indicated that it wants to discuss the problems. The recent China-EU comprehensive agreement on investment led to modest improvements in SOEs and subsidies. We could build on previous talks between the US and China on the bilateral investment treaty, which the discussions ended there in 2017. We could also reach back to the Obama-Xi agreement on cyber and pick up these negotiations again. And while they're all going to be difficult, incremental progress can be made. We'll never get to perfect, but incremental progress should not be undervalued. The new administration might not wish to use the Trump nomenclature. You don't have to call this phase 2. Moreover, it could be a succession of smaller agreements on specific topics, but we need to get the momentum moving again. And I believe that using the phase 1, phase 2 roadmap that both sides have already agreed upon is the best way going forward. So my fourth recommendation is that we got to get rid of the tariffs. And hopefully, and perhaps consider purchase targets following a phase 2 agreement for 2022 and 2023. We must recall that currently, and perhaps in perpetuity if we're not smart, tariffs going both ways across the Pacific are at 20%. And unless these are addressed, it could become permanent. Tariffs are easy to put up, they're sticky to come down. And the longer they're up, the harder they are to come down. Tariffs are both job killers and they have impoverished consumers and households in both China and in the United States. And if they become permanent, they will distort US-China relations permanently. And it will be difficult ever for the two largest industrial economies ever to move towards a normal relationship if we risk that permanent handicap on our trade and investment. As I showed before, if our research suggests that if tariffs were lowered to 12%, there'd be a net gain of 145,000 jobs by 2025. If the tariffs were fully removed, especially in concert with market access improvements associated with the phase 2 agreement, the job gains would be much higher. Fifth, following the completion of a phase 2 negotiation and elimination of the tariffs, we should continue to negotiate with the Chinese using the CPTPP as a discussion framework. Now, let me just step back 1 second and let's just do a reality check. It should be clear that the economic architecture of Asia is very different now than it was when President Trump entered office. The Chinese and their partners have been very successful changing the economic architecture, concluding the 15-country RCEP agreement. The Chinese and the Europeans have successfully concluded their comprehensive agreement on investment. The Belt and Road has changed supply chains and how goods move across Asia. And China's trade negotiators have been very busy and very successful. Give credit where credit is due. And finally, China's President Li and President Xi have both stated numerous times that China will consider entering the CPTPP. We need to take them at the word. We need to stop underestimating them, as has been our want. As Chinese economists will tell me, the next logical step in China's domestic economic reform and opening program is to join CPTPP. While China's entry into CPTPP is going to take some time, one should not doubt their determination to do so. While it's not politically feasible right now, to ask USTR designate Catherine Dai to consider negotiating U.S. entry into the CPTPP, that perception will change dramatically if the Chinese appear to be moving to join the agreement without us. If the Chinese do join the agreement without America joining the agreement, we will be locked out of Asia, the world's fastest growing market. This would be a historic turning point in American history, and it would be difficult to recover. To hedge from this risk, it just makes sense for the two world's largest economies to talk to each other in terms of the rules associated with an agreement that they both one day may join. The CPTPP is largely based on US trade law, and it is almost perfectly, not completely, complementary with USMCA. And so while I admit that this recommendation is longer term, at minimum second half of the Biden administration, and that I admit also that we can't know the employment effects of joining the CPTPP, you need a strategy to move forward. And in my view, talking with the Chinese in discussions structured around the CPTPP is in America's long-term interest. My next three recommendations are much more short-term, and to be honest, they lie outside of the remit of traditional trade diplomacy, but they would have immediate and quantifiable benefits for American workers. So, six, in preparation for the post-COVID world, we should move immediately to remove offensive visa restrictions against CCP members and their families, and facilitate a return, facilitate an increase in Chinese tourism to the United States in preparing for the post-pandemic era. As you may recall from my previous slide, travel and tourism in the United States is our single largest export to China, worth as much as $30 billion a year prior to COVID-19. However, the Trump administration put into place restrictions on 92 million CCP members and their families visiting the United States. These regulations are offensive, but equally important, they're completely unenforceable and have very little anchorage in any US law, and they should be abolished immediately. Travel and tourism is a very labor-intensive industry, and continued expansion of our exports of these services, an increase in these services to China would be especially beneficial to lower income Americans, including waiters, drivers, workers in hotel, retail, etc. There's no doubt that there is a huge demand for the travel to the United States, and that continued expansion of this market is very likely in the COVID era if the US government will get out of the way. Abolishing the visa restrictions on CCP members and their families would be smart, and it's easy, and it would generate income for hundreds of thousands of our fellow citizens, especially those hammered economically by the pandemic. So seventh, the Biden administration should be clear that civilian Chinese students are welcome at American universities in all fields that are not directly related to national security. Education is a $15 billion export, and Chinese students remain committed to studying in the United States if they know that they are safe and welcome. Now, there are many competitors in this market, and the Australians and the Europeans would be happy to take this business. And Chinese domestic competition is becoming very good. So we must not be complacent. There now have been a number of well-reported reports of excesses and inappropriate behavior by some Chinese researchers at American institutions. It is also clear that the Chinese Thousand Talents campaign is really pathetically non-transparent, and it may induce researchers into relationships that may be improper. But it's also true that our excesses in response to these problems have led to unfair treatment of hundreds, if not thousands, of individual Chinese and Chinese American academics and researchers. Now, universities and research institutions are dealing with the problem by tightening up their governance reporting and ethical procedures, which I think we all really welcome, while maintaining academic freedom and expanding collaboration at the technical exchange with Chinese civilian counterparts. So I think that the academic institutions need to tighten up, and it's within each academic institution's remit to govern itself appropriately. But when we're comfortable there, we should expand our collaboration with Chinese academics, researchers in all fields outside of the military. Eighth, we should welcome Chinese investment in the United States in all industries and localities that do not have clear national security implications. Now, when you look back at U.S. economic history, going back centuries, we've always had an open capital account. We're Americans, of course we have an open capital account. And always we have used investment as a way to balance trade surpluses. We did that with the Japanese in the 70s, with Taiwan and Korea in the 80s and 90s, with Germany and England and France in the 1800s. Today, we need more Chinese investment in the United States, particularly in areas that have high unemployment and suffer from chronic underdevelopment. Now, there's a huge demand in China to invest in the United States in dozens of industries that have no national security implications. Now, the US should welcome such investment. And while every mayor and governor in the United States would welcome this Chinese investors in their jurisdiction, the federal government clearly does not. And this chart shows the reduction in unemployment or in employment as a result of decreasing Chinese investment. Chinese investment declined 90% from 2017 to last year, resulting in 30,000 fewer jobs in 2018 compared to 2017. Now, CFIUS and FIRMA, our inbound regulatory regimes, are necessary. However, they've been applied in a manner that makes it clear that the federal government wants to reduce investment from China as little as possible. This is counterproductive, and the new administration should change it. Why? It hurts American workers. There are many Chinese potential factories that are mothballed, that are halfway done, ready to go, ready to hire people that not quite working. So to be balanced, I have to note that the Chinese government has also been regulating outbound investment to the United States and elsewhere more strictly. And thus, the US policies of FIRMA and CFIUS are not the only impediment. Nonetheless, if we do not allow Chinese investment in the United States, like the tariffs, we risk condemning ourselves to long-term strategic imbalances with China. And this is not a future to which we should wish to aspire. We should get rid of the tariffs, welcome Chinese investment, and get back to a normal economic situation. Ninth, we need to address the supply chain resiliency issues really with carrots, incentives, and not trade distorting tariffs or sticks. As a result of COVID and a concern for potential shocks to our supply chain, it is reasonable to aspire to greater supply chain resilience and flexibility to ensure the supply of critical goods in times of emergency. However, the government should be extremely careful before using coercive tactics to reshore manufacturing or force companies to produce in one jurisdiction or another. Tariffs are an incredibly blunt instrument, and there are precious few cases that I am aware of that tariffs have incentivized manufacturing investment in the United States. Yes, tariffs have moved manufacturing from China to ASEAN countries, I hope that Maquiadora has benefited from this at least somewhat. I'm not sure. But does this really help American workers? Does it really help our resilience? How does it help employment in the United States? If the U.S. government wishes to induce companies to invest domestically, it should provide WTO compliant incentives to this end and allow companies to make decisions on where they want to buy what. Finally, it is imperative, in my view, that we address the challenges of data and export controls and technology policy in a more comprehensive manner, preferably in alignment with our friends in Europe and in Japan. In my view, technology is by far the most important and difficult element of the bilateral relationship, especially over the longer term. There should be zero doubt that the Chinese also believe that technology self-reliance and self-strengthening, 科技自行自强, which we hear about all the time, is a key national objective. It is unfortunate that Chinese policies associated with technology self-reliance and strengthening are so often WTO illegal and outside of OECD norms, such as the Thousand Talents campaign. In addition, the Chinese R&D establishment is too often plagued by waste, fraud, and abuse, just encouraging problems when Chinese scientists deal with the international community. But it's, of course, more difficult. In addition to the trade policy and governance problems within Chinese tech, there's also the specter of civil-military fusion and the Chinese intelligence law, both of which cast a chilling light on civilian technology cooperation with Chinese universities, institutions, and academics. China really needs to reconsider these laws, which are complete global outliers and not found in any other country of which I am aware. So without being naive, I think that there is some degree to which international negotiations and better bureaucratic hygiene could lead to China transitioning from playing kind of a more predatory catch-up role in the global economic innovation ecosystem to playing an integrated, trusted partnership role with the other great research countries in this global innovation ecosystem. That is a goal to which we should aspire. And it is in the interest of Chinese civilian institutions to better integrate with those global R&D norms, values, and procedures. So as this problem is so critical and multidimensional, I strongly endorse the idea of a new office in the White House to coordinate global technology and data policy. The first job is to create coherence within the US government. Currently, there are some 12 agencies, probably more, dealing with these problems, but not necessarily coordinated. And sometimes the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And I think that help from direction, coordination from the White House would be very, very welcome. In addition, that office could much better coordinate with our allies. Who are our allies going to talk to about these problems, if not somebody in the White House? And the office could negotiate with the Chinese and others on the rules of the road for technology cooperation, the rules of the road for technology competition, and most importantly, the mechanisms to enforce those rules. So the Europeans had recently put forward a proposal to form a transatlantic trade and technology council. And I think that this would be a great start. I would also highly like to commend Susan and all of the work that you and your colleagues, Peter Cowie and many others, have done in this area. And I keep a copy of your report on my desk here, and I'd love further to work with you more on that. But this is the central, technology is the central question of the relationship for the rest of my lifetime. I think that the US side needs to have a coordinator in the White House to help better lead this negotiation. Perhaps that could come from the National Science Foundation, the president's science advisor, but it would have to be a beefed up role. Not sure about the bureaucratics. So in conclusion, I've tried to outline here 10 ideas that would help to grow employment in the United States over the short, medium, and longer term without prejudicing our overall geopolitical and diplomatic challenges in China. In an ideal world, we would be able to enumerate exactly the economic impact of each of these items on a complex and dynamic American labor market, but it's not an ideal world. It's impossible to be precise about these numbers. Nonetheless, I am confident that the 10 policy recommendations that I've made will lead to a much healthier American economy and myriad job opportunities for American citizens. The United States and China have a complex security and economic relationship, but we must change the overall dynamic of the relationship to be more competitive and less confrontational, mindful of both our security and our economic needs, and bridging these two worlds whenever possible. And I hope that these are some ideas that are worthy of consideration. Susan, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for a wonderful talk. And for participants, we're going to have the text and the PowerPoint slides available, linked on the website, so you can review it after this session. So, Craig, we don't have a whole lot of time. I'm just going to ask one quick question and then one or two from the floor. When I look at your recommendations, I'm struck by the ones related to tourism, to Chinese students, and to Chinese investment in the US. They require no negotiation with China at all. They simply, these are things that the United States can do unilaterally. And and they would be job creating. So the question I have, I guess, is why are our domestic interest groups, including labor groups, universities, why aren't we lobbying harder for the Biden administration to reverse the measures that have been taken over the last 4 years, largely because the China security threat seems to loom so large, and the political ideological threat, system threat. So why are we not seeing more demand for changes on tourism, students, and Chinese investment?
Yeah, thank you, Susan. I think that that there are kind of three different sets of interest groups here. I would commend the universities for what they've done, and the most important thing is tightening up on some of the ethical and rules of contracts and other rules of engagement. And so I'm hopeful that that will be effective. On the investment side, I think that there's been total overreach, kind of typical of kind of a Cold War mentality that all investment is bad. And I know that under the Trump administration, that there were active measures to really exaggerate the enforcement of CFIUS and FIRMA. So I think that there's a course correction there that can be made given the Biden administration's call for jobs. And maybe we could make that more explicit. Let's talk about yarn mills in Arkansas. Let's talk about paper mills in Michigan. Let's talk about food agriculture in Kentucky. those are the projects that I know of that are on ice because of our overly restrictive policies, all in areas that are economically deprived, which is really the absurdity of it all. So on the travel side, I am confident that the State Department will make moves on this simply because it was a last minute kind of vindictive posture that might have been put in as much to box in the Biden administration as to meet a national objective. But it is offensive not only to CCP members and their families, but probably to all Chinese to give CCP to ask that question, which there's no real room for on the visa form. We don't ask it anywhere else. It's completely sui generis. So it would take a stroke of the pen to get rid of that, and it should be done. And I think that the business community is lobbying for that, just given the simplicity of this. But these are things that are going to have to change over time. And yes, we need adjustments. The universities have adjusted well, I think, anyway. And post-COVID, right now it doesn't make sense to talk about travel and tourism, but post-COVID, this is a huge money spinner for our least advantaged citizens. And in my view, let's get back to first principles and take care of it.
A few people ask about reviving the WTO. Do you think this is an important move that would also help preserve American jobs, especially taking up those difficult issues of subsidies, investment? Do you think we should try to get the WTO to expand to address those kinds of issues now? Or do you think that we need to create other multilateral or bilateral approaches on those issues?
So the Trump administration had a very much unilateral and bilateral approach to China. And we very much underutilized the regional and the multilateral. And it's like a carpenter who takes only a hammer and uses a hammer when he should use a saw or a screwdriver. It just didn't work very well. So we need all of the bilateral, unilateral, multilateral tools. And in this regard, I think that the CPTPP is a stepping stone to WTO reform. WTO reform is a huge, massive undertaking where there has to be a consensus of 184 members, and that doesn't work very well. But the CPTPP, based on U.S. trade law, interstate trade law for the most part, and enshrined in USMCA, is an excellent stepping stone to that. Also, there's a trilateral between the EU, Japan, and the US, which has proven to be very helpful. And that's why another reason why I really like this transatlantic trade and technology discussion, because maybe we could take some of the TPP ideas, which were also discussed in TTIP, and I think not universally accepted, but with some degree of consensus. And then ultimately, if we're able to get US, Japan, Europe consensus, broaden it out from there, hopefully in accordance with CPTPP. But CPTPP is the kind of the best mechanism going forward. The UK wants to join. The Koreans and the Filipinos and the Indonesians are interested. Our former negotiating partners, in my view, will welcome us back with flowers. We need to get trade promotion authority, and this is too difficult right now. It is a longer term prospect, perhaps the end of the Biden administration or going in to the next administration. Right now, there's not a political appetite for it, but it's something that we should be working for under the surface, kind of like the duck backpedaling with nothing moving on the surface, but a lot moving under the surface.
Okay. Another question from the audience is, do you have any specific recommendations about CFIUS reform? Of course, CFIUS is the interagency process to review foreign investment in the United States.
I think that that CFIUS and FIRMA are needed. That's the first thing. I think that that the way that they have been implemented, kind of the big hairy thread out there without things being specifically said, is really the unfortunate thing. And I think that an articulation by the Department of Commerce or the Department of State that, yeah, outside of geopolitical areas, we welcome Chinese investment and let's go after it. You know, again, I mentioned the yarn factory in Arkansas, the catfish, Chinese catfish, Asian catfish processing facility on the Ohio River in Appalachia. You know, there's a ton of basic industry and agriculture and natural resource and real estate that has no conceivable impact, but it's been tarred by this broad brush, and that is to the detriment of our most impoverished regions and peoples, and it's something that is unnecessary and very unfortunate. I think that.
Let me ask you one last question because we're running out of time. How much of a hurdle, one of our audience members asked, how much of a hurdle will the Xinjiang problem be to resolving trade issues between the US and China?
So I think that this is a big problem. I think that new legislation will pass, which will essentially ban imports to the U.S. if there is anything in that from Xinjiang. I would give that about a 99% chance of passing. Now, that's sort of like the Chinese passing a law banning imports from a particular American state. Now, how do you do that? And what are the WTO implications of that? Now, the Chinese, I think, are recognizing that this is a big problem. And recently, we have been advocating that they open up Xinjiang to labor inspections or other inspections, journalists, UN rights observers, and whatnot. And actually, over the last week or so, they've been talking about that, I think out of concern for the Olympics. And also out of concern for the comprehensive agreement on investment with the EU. So I'm hopeful that we won't have to pass this law because it could be an unprecedented hindrance on global commerce when we start blackballing, if you will, an entire province. If we do that, the Chinese could do it and anybody could do it. And then global trade will be really in a bad way. So hopefully there's a way to address the very legitimate concerns in Xinjiang without having to go there. But I do expect the law to be passed.
Well, thanks so much for a terrific talk. I for one, have a clear sense of all the different elements of our trade policy and economic policy that have employment consequences. And since we are really concerned about the working people, this is a good strategy to look at these different types of policies and see how they can be adjusted by the next administration. So thanks so much for this superb talk. Thanks also for joining the leadership board of 21st Century China Center, and we look forward to seeing you in person here on campus.
Terrific. Thank you, Susan.
Okay,
thank you, Lei.
And
very
thank
grateful.
you to the audience very much for joining in.
Thank you, everyone.